Long before California became known for crowded cities, movie studios, and busy highways, it was a distant frontier at the far edge of North America. In the 1840s, reaching California was an adventure in itself. There were no railroads crossing the continent. A traveler could spend months making the overland journey by wagon, or sail thousands of miles around the dangerous waters of Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. To many Americans living in the East, California felt almost unimaginably far away. The landscape was different as well. Great valleys stretched between mountain ranges. Rivers flowed out of the Sierra Nevada, winding through forests of pine and oak before reaching the Pacific Ocean. Small settlements dotted the countryside, but much of the region remained quiet and undeveloped. Life moved at a slower pace. Farmers tended fields, ranchers cared for cattle, trappers and traders followed old routes through the mountains. At a place called Sutter's Fort, established by Swiss immigrant John Sutter, workers and settlers came and went as California slowly grew. John Sutter dreamed of building an agricultural empire in the Sacramento Valley. He owned vast amounts of land and employed laborers to build mills, workshops, and farms. Among those workers was a carpenter and mechanic named James Wilson Marshall. Marshall was practical, quiet, and known for his ability to solve problems. In 1847, he was placed in charge of constructing a sawmill for Sutter along the American River at a place called Coloma. The work was difficult but ordinary. Each day, crews cut timber, moved stones, and dug channels to direct water toward the mill wheel. It was the sort of project that attracted little attention outside the local community. No one involved could have imagined that this isolated construction site was about to become one of the most famous places in American history. On the morning of January 24, 1848, James Marshall walked along the mill race, inspecting the previous day's work. As the first sunlight reached the shallow water, something unusual caught his eye. Tiny, bright flakes rested among the gravel. Marshall bent down and picked one up. He later recalled that it looked like metal, but not like anything he had seen before. Curious, he performed a few simple tests. The small pieces could be hammered flat, but would not break apart. They seemed unusually heavy for their size. Marshall believed he might have found gold. He carried a few samples to John Sutter. Together, the two men tested the strange yellow flakes using methods available to them at the time. They boiled them, struck them with hammers, and exposed them to chemicals. The results all pointed toward the same conclusion. It really was gold. For a moment, the discovery was treated as a secret. Sutter feared that if the news spread, his workers would abandon the farms and mill projects he had spent years building. Marshall shared the same concern. The sawmill was unfinished, and both men wanted the work to continue. They agreed to keep quiet. But secrets have a way of escaping, especially secrets that promise the possibility of unimaginable wealth. At first, the news traveled slowly. Workers whispered to one another. Visitors to the mill carried stories to nearby settlements. A trader might mention hearing about gold in the hills. A traveler heading east would repeat the tale at the next stop along the trail. Many people dismissed the stories as exaggeration. The American frontier was already full of rumors about hidden riches and lost mines. Most came to nothing. But this time was different. As spring turned to summer in 1848, more and more people quietly left their jobs and headed toward the American River. Farmers abandoned fields that still needed planting. Shopkeepers locked their doors. Laborers disappeared almost overnight. One of the strangest stories from the early days of the gold rush came from San Francisco. At the time, the city was still a small settlement with only a few hundred permanent residents. When newspapers confirmed the reports from Coloma, employees at printing offices reportedly left their desks to search for gold themselves. Some businesses closed because there was simply no one left to operate them. The excitement was impossible to ignore. By late 1848, word had reached Washington, D.C. President James K. Polk addressed Congress and confirmed that the reports of gold in California were true. That single announcement changed everything. The rumor became a certainty. Across the United States and soon across the world, people began making plans. Farmers sold their land. Merchants packed wagons. Sailors signed onto ships bound for California. Families sat around dinner tables asking themselves a simple question. What if the stories were true? What if ordinary people really could change their lives with one lucky discovery? For many, the answer was impossible to resist. The year 1849 was approaching, and with it came a movement of people unlike anything the young nation had ever seen. Soon they would earn a name that history would never forget: the 49ers. By the beginning of 1849, the quiet discovery at Sutter's mill had become an international sensation. The news spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Newspapers printed stories of nuggets lying in riverbeds and men becoming rich overnight. Letters traveled east, describing streams where gold could supposedly be picked up by hand. Travelers repeated the stories in taverns, general stores, and town squares across the country. No one knew exactly how much gold had been found, but they all wondered the same thing. What if there was enough for everyone? The people who answered that question by leaving for California would become known as the 49ers, named after the year in which the Great Migration reached its peak. They came from every walk of life. Farmers left behind fields that had been in their families for generations. Shopkeepers locked the doors to their businesses. Blacksmiths, teachers, carpenters, sailors, and clerks all looked west and imagined a future unlike the one they had known. Some were young men chasing adventure. Others were fathers hoping to earn enough money to provide for their families. A few brought wives and children with them, believing they would build a new life together in California. The decision was rarely an easy one. Many sold nearly everything they owned to finance the journey. Farms were auctioned. Livestock was traded. Family heirlooms that had been carefully preserved for years were exchanged for wagons, tools, and supplies. Neighbors gathered to say goodbye, knowing there was a good chance they would never see one another again. The journey itself was a gamble. There were three main ways to reach California. The first was the overland route, crossing the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the deserts of the American West by wagon. The second was by sea, sailing all the way around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. The voyage could take 5 or 6 months and was often rough and dangerous. The third option involved sailing to Panama, crossing the narrow strip of land by canoe, mule, and on foot, and then finding another ship waiting on the Pacific side. It was faster, but tropical disease and difficult conditions made the crossing risky. No matter which route they chose, the trip required determination. For many people, it was the longest journey they would ever make. One traveler later wrote that he had never been more than 20 miles from home before deciding to travel to California. Now, he was preparing to cross an entire continent. As spring arrived, long wagon trains once again gathered in Independence, Missouri, the same town that had served as a starting point for so many Oregon Trail pioneers. The roads filled with activity. Blacksmiths repaired wagon wheels. Merchants sold flour, bacon, coffee, shovels, picks, lanterns, and mining pans. General stores did a brisk business, and prices rose as demand increased. There was an air of excitement everywhere. People spoke of fortunes waiting in the rivers of California. Few stopped to consider how many thousands of others were hearing the exact same stories. As the 49ers moved west, the idea of California grew larger in their imaginations. Some believed they would spend a few weeks collecting gold before returning home wealthy. Others dreamed of buying farms, opening businesses, or starting entirely new lives. The reality was often far more complicated. One of the great ironies of the gold rush is that many of the people who became truly wealthy never mined for gold at all. Instead, they sold goods and services to the miners. Merchants charged high prices for food, clothing, and equipment. Boarding houses rented out simple beds for astonishing amounts of money. Laundry services, blacksmith shops, and supply stores often earned more reliable profits than the goldfields themselves. A lesser-known example is Levi Strauss. Today, he is remembered for blue jeans, but he did not originally travel west to make clothing. He came to California to sell dry goods and supplies to miners. When he realized durable work pants were in high demand, he adapted his business and built a company that would become famous around the world. The mining camps themselves grew almost overnight. What had been quiet stretches of river only months earlier suddenly filled with tents, wooden cabins, wagons, and thousands of hopeful prospectors. Campfires lit the hillsides after sunset, and the sounds of hammers, shovels, and conversation echoed through the valleys. People arrived not only from the eastern United States, but from Mexico, South America, Europe, Australia, and China. In many ways, the California gold rush became one of the first truly international migrations to the American West. Yet for all the excitement, daily life could be difficult. Prices in the mining camps were incredibly high. A single egg might cost what would be several dollars today. A shovel, a pair of boots, or a simple meal could cost many times more than it would back east. Almost everything had to be transported over enormous distances, and merchants knew that desperate miners were willing to pay. The search for gold itself required patience. Most prospectors did not stumble across giant nuggets. Instead, they spent long days kneeling beside cold rivers, swirling water and gravel in shallow pans, hoping to catch the faint glimmer of tiny flakes settling to the bottom. The work was repetitive. Hours could pass without finding anything at all. Then, perhaps, a few bright specks would appear, just enough to convince someone to try again tomorrow. That hope kept people going. Every miner knew stories of lucky discoveries. A neighbor might uncover a rich deposit. A traveler passing through camp might claim to have seen nuggets the size of walnuts. Whether the stories were true hardly mattered. The belief that tomorrow might be different was often enough. As thousands continued pouring into California, the quiet frontier that James Marshall and John Sutter had once known began disappearing. The rivers grew crowded, the camps grew larger, and the dream of easy riches slowly collided with the much harder reality of life in the goldfields. For many 49ers, the greatest adventure was still ahead of them. but so were the greatest disappointments. By the middle of 1849, the California gold rush was no longer just a rumor. It had become a world of its own. The quiet rivers and wooded valleys of the Sierra Nevada were transformed almost overnight into sprawling camps of tents, cabins, wagons, and thousands upon thousands of hopeful prospectors. From a distance, some of the camps looked almost like new towns appearing by magic. Smoke drifted upward from hundreds of campfires. The sound of axes echoed through the trees as new shelters were built. Mules and horses carried supplies over narrow trails, while merchants pushed heavily loaded wagons toward the latest mining district. Yet, despite the crowds, life in the goldfields could be surprisingly lonely. Most miners worked alone or in very small groups. They would wake before sunrise, prepare a simple breakfast, and head toward the nearest stream, carrying little more than a pan, a shovel, and the hope that today would be the day everything changed. The work itself was not glamorous. The popular image of miners discovering giant nuggets lying on the ground was, for most people, little more than a fantasy. The reality involved long hours standing in cold water, scooping gravel into shallow metal pans, and carefully swirling the mixture back and forth. The process was simple. Water washed away the lighter sand and dirt, while heavier materials settled to the bottom. If luck was on a miner's side, a few tiny flakes of gold might remain. Then the process would begin again, and again, hour after hour. One miner later wrote that the search for gold involved 1,000 motions exactly alike, interrupted only by hope. That hope was perhaps the most valuable thing in the camps. A man might spend weeks finding almost nothing, only to hear that someone nearby had uncovered a rich deposit. Stories spread quickly. A lucky strike on one creek could send hundreds of miners rushing to a completely different valley by the following morning. Entire camps appeared and disappeared with astonishing speed. A quiet hillside one week might become home to hundreds of tents the next. Then, after the easiest gold had been collected, the people would move on again, leaving behind abandoned cabins, broken tools, and empty fire pits, slowly being reclaimed by nature. One of the lesser-known facts about the gold rush is that many miners became experts at reading the landscape. They looked for bends in rivers where heavier materials might settle. They studied exposed rock formations and watched how water flowed after heavy rain. Some even followed the advice of experienced trappers and local Native Americans who understood the land far better than the newcomers arriving from the east. But no amount of knowledge could guarantee success. Gold was unpredictable. Two men could work only a few feet apart, and one might uncover a valuable deposit while the other found almost nothing at all. The uncertainty became part of daily life, and for many, it was the possibility of tomorrow's discovery, not today's results, that kept them searching. As more people poured into California, the mining camps took on lives of their own. The camps were busy from dawn until long after dark. During the day, prospectors searched the rivers, while merchants unloaded supplies and blacksmiths repaired broken tools. At night, lanterns and campfires lit the hillsides as people gathered to cook, talk, and exchange stories. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the air. Coffee simmered in blackened kettles. Bacon sizzled over open fires. The sound of hammers striking metal mixed with distant laughter and the occasional tune from a fiddle or harmonica. Many miners lived in simple canvas tents. Others built rough cabins from logs and timber cut nearby. Furniture was scarce. A wooden crate might serve as a chair, while a rolled-up blanket became a pillow after a long day's work. Comfort was a luxury few could afford. The camps attracted people from around the world. Americans worked alongside immigrants from Ireland, Germany, France, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Australia, and China. Different languages could be heard around the campfires, and new arrivals often shared stories about the long journeys that had brought them to California. This mixture of cultures made the gold rush unlike almost anything America had seen before. Yet for all the excitement, the camps were expensive places to live. A simple meal could cost several times what it would back east. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare and costly. One visitor was amazed to find that an egg could sell for what seemed like an unbelievable price, while a pair of sturdy boots might cost nearly a month's wages for a laborer. There was an old saying that began circulating through the mining camps. During the gold rush, the people selling the shovels were the ones getting rich. There was more truth to that saying than many realized. Store owners, blacksmiths, hotel operators, and merchants often earned steady profits, while miners gambled everything on chance. Some prospectors worked for months without finding enough gold to cover the cost of their supplies. And yet, very few gave up. Every camp had stories. Someone always knew a man who had found a nugget the size of his hand. Another claimed that a nearby creek held enough gold to make everyone wealthy. Whether the stories were true hardly mattered. They kept hope alive. As evening settled over the hills, tired miners sat around the fire cleaning their pans and talking quietly about what tomorrow might bring. Some wrote letters home by lantern light, describing the strange new world they had found. Many of those letters painted a brighter picture than reality, reluctant to admit that the dream was proving harder than expected. Above them, the California sky filled with stars. The rivers continued flowing quietly through the valleys, carrying with them the same tiny flakes of gold that had first caught James Marshall's attention only a short time before. But as the months passed, more and more miners began to realize an uncomfortable truth. California was changing them just as much as they were changing California. And for many, the greatest treasure they would find would not be gold at all. As the months passed, many 49ers slowly began to understand that the California gold rush was not unfolding the way they had imagined. The stories that had reached the East often focused on the lucky few. The miner who uncovered a rich deposit, or the traveler who returned home carrying bags of gold dust. But those stories left out an important detail. For every miner who struck it rich, there were hundreds who did not. Many spent weeks standing knee-deep in cold rivers, working from sunrise until sunset, only to discover that they had barely earned enough to pay for food and supplies. Some moved from one mining camp to another, convinced that the next creek or valley would finally bring them the fortune they had been chasing. It was a cycle repeated over and over again. Hope would rise with every rumor of a new discovery. Then disappointment would follow. One of the most fascinating and lesser-known truths about the gold rush is that many of the largest fortunes were made by people who never searched for gold at all. Instead, they sold goods and services to the miners. As thousands of people poured into California, the demand for everyday necessities exploded. Food, clothing, tools, lodging, transportation, and basic household items all became valuable. A merchant with a wagon full of shovels could sometimes make more money than a dozen prospectors working the riverbanks. A blacksmith repairing broken picks and wagon wheels might earn steady wages every single day. Hotel owners rented out simple rooms at astonishing prices, while restaurant owners charged whatever the market would bear for a hot meal. One visitor to San Francisco observed that almost everything in the city seemed expensive. A dozen eggs could cost what many workers back east earned in several days. A simple haircut might cost the equivalent of a week's wages. Boots, flour, coffee, candles, and nails were all sold at prices that seemed almost unbelievable, and yet people paid them. Because California had become a place where almost everyone believed that tomorrow might be the day they found gold. Perhaps no story captures this better than that of Levi Strauss. Today, his name is known around the world because of blue jeans. But when he first traveled to California, he was not a clothing manufacturer. He was a young businessman bringing dry goods and supplies to the booming mining communities. As he spoke with miners, he realized they all shared a common complaint. Their clothing wore out quickly. Long days of digging, lifting, and kneeling beside rocky streams destroyed ordinary work pants. Strauss eventually partnered with tailor Jacob Davis to create reinforced denim trousers using copper rivets. The miners needed durable clothing. Strauss supplied it. And in the end, the business built around the gold rush proved far more valuable than the search for gold itself. Stories like these became increasingly common. Some people made fortunes selling lumber. Others transported goods by mule or wagon between camps. Ferry operators charged miners to cross rivers. Laundry services, barbers, cooks, and blacksmiths all discovered that reliable work could often be more profitable than gambling everything on a lucky strike. Slowly, the California gold rush began changing from a simple treasure hunt into something much larger. It was becoming an economy. A new society was taking shape in the hills and valleys of the American West, and that transformation would leave a permanent mark on California. As thousands of hopeful prospectors continued arriving, California itself began to change at an astonishing pace. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in San Francisco. Before the discovery of gold, it had been a small settlement with a modest population. But within just a few years, it became one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. Ships crowded the harbor. Some had sailed all the way around Cape Horn, carrying passengers from New York, Boston, London, and ports across South America. Others arrived from China, Australia, and the islands of the Pacific. Yet something unusual happened once many of those ships reached California. The crews abandoned them. Captains, sailors, and dock workers often deserted their vessels to join the gold rush themselves. So many ships were left empty in San Francisco Bay that some were eventually converted into warehouses, hotels, jails, and even businesses built directly on top of the old hulls. It was one of the strangest sights in the growing city. A harbor filled with forgotten ships whose owners had gone looking for gold. The mining camps changed just as quickly. A few tents beside a river could become a bustling settlement in only a matter of weeks. Wooden buildings replaced canvas shelters. General stores appeared. Hotels, blacksmith shops, and saloons opened their doors. Then, just as suddenly, the gold would run out. People would pack their wagons and move on. The camp would be abandoned, leaving behind empty buildings and silent streets. Many of the ghost towns scattered across the American West today began exactly this way. The gold rush brought excitement and opportunity, but it also brought disappointment. Not every miner returned home wealthy. In fact, many returned with little more than they had when they arrived. Some spent years searching without finding enough gold to justify the cost of the journey. Others discovered that the work was simply too difficult, or that they missed their families and homes back east. James Marshall himself, the man who first discovered the gold, never became rich from his discovery. Despite changing the course of American history, he struggled financially for much of the rest of his life. John Sutter fared little better. The gold rush that he had hoped to keep secret ultimately overwhelmed his land and businesses. Workers abandoned his projects, settlers occupied his property, and much of the empire he had worked to build slowly disappeared. There is something almost poetic about that. The two men whose names are forever linked to the beginning of the California gold rush gained very little from it personally. Instead, the greatest rewards often went to those who quietly adapted to the changing world around them. By the early 1850s, it had become clear that California would never be the same again. The rivers had drawn people west, but the gold rush had created something much bigger than a mining boom. It had sparked the rapid growth of cities, encouraged immigration from around the world, and helped transform a distant frontier into one of the most important regions of the United States. For the miners sitting beside their campfires at night, staring into the flames and wondering what tomorrow might bring, those larger changes were difficult to see. They were simply chasing a dream. But together, their hopes, struggles, and determination were helping shape the future of the American West itself. And long after the last rich claims had been worked and the camps had fallen quiet, that legacy would remain. By the early 1850s, the first great wave of the California gold rush was beginning to settle. The rivers and streams that had once been quiet and isolated were now lined with camps, cabins, and small communities. Trails worn by thousands of boots and wagon wheels connected places that only a few years earlier had barely appeared on maps. What had begun with a few bright flakes in the waters of the American River had become one of the largest migrations in American history. The numbers were astonishing. In 1848, only a few thousand non-native settlers lived in California. Within just a few years, that number had grown into the hundreds of thousands. People arrived not only from every corner of the United States, but from nearly every part of the world. The gold rush transformed California into a meeting place of cultures, languages, and traditions. New communities appeared almost overnight. Roads were built where none had existed before. General stores, schools, churches, and newspapers followed the miners west. Farmers began supplying food to the growing population, while merchants established businesses that would outlast the mining camps themselves. San Francisco experienced perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. Before the discovery of gold, it had been little more than a small coastal settlement. But by the early 1850s, it had become a thriving port city filled with ships, warehouses, hotels, banks, and businesses serving the endless flow of newcomers. The abandoned vessels that had once crowded the harbor became part of the city's unusual landscape. Some were dismantled for lumber. Others were pulled onto land and incorporated into new buildings. For years afterward, construction workers occasionally uncovered the remains of old gold rush ships buried beneath the growing city. The demand for gold also encouraged new inventions and new methods of mining. At first, prospectors used little more than pans and simple hand tools. Later came rockers and sluice boxes, allowing miners to process larger amounts of gravel. Before long, entire companies invested in industrial-scale mining operations, using powerful streams of water to wash away hillsides in search of buried deposits. The age of the lone prospector slowly began to fade. Large businesses with expensive equipment increasingly replaced the independent miner working alone beside a river. For many of the original 49ers, this change was disappointing. The dream they had chased, a simple life where hard work and a little luck could make an ordinary person wealthy, was becoming harder to find. Some miners settled permanently in California and started farms or businesses. Others quietly returned home, carrying stories of adventure instead of bags of gold. A few achieved the fortunes they had dreamed of. Many did not. Yet almost all of them had participated in something extraordinary. The California gold rush did more than fill pockets with gold dust. It accelerated the growth of the American West, strengthened connections between distant parts of the country, and helped shape the future of a young nation still discovering what it would become. In 1850, only 2 years after James Marshall made his discovery at Sutter's Mill, California was admitted to the Union as the 31st state. The transformation had happened with astonishing speed, and in many ways, the echoes of the gold rush could still be felt across the frontier. The wagon trails carrying hopeful miners west would later be followed by stagecoaches, mail routes, and eventually railroads. The camps that survived would become towns. Some towns would become cities, and the dream that drew so many people toward California would become part of the larger story of the American West. Today, the rivers of the Sierra Nevada flow much as they always have. The forests remain. The mountains still rise above the valleys. To someone standing quietly beside the American River, it can be difficult to imagine the extraordinary events that unfolded there nearly 2 centuries ago. Yet the California gold rush left marks that can still be seen. Old mining equipment rests quietly in museums and abandoned camps. Weathered buildings survive in historic towns that once echoed with the sounds of hammers, wagon wheels, and hopeful conversation. In a few places, visitors can still see the scars left behind by 19th century mining operations. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the gold rush is not found in the landscape. It is found in the stories. The story of James Marshall, the quiet carpenter who noticed something unusual shining in the water and unknowingly changed the course of history. The story of John Sutter, whose dream of building an agricultural empire was overwhelmed by an event he had desperately tried to keep secret. The story of the merchants, blacksmiths, cooks, laundresses, and storekeepers who discovered that the surest path to success was not digging for gold, but helping others chase their dreams. And perhaps most of all, the story of the ordinary men and women who looked toward a distant frontier and decided to take a chance on an uncertain future. Many of them never became wealthy. Many returned home with little more than the memories of the journey itself. But their travels helped build new communities, connect distant regions, and transform California from a remote frontier into one of the most important places in the United States. There is an old saying often connected to the gold rush. It was not the gold that made California rich. It was the people who came looking for it. Whether or not those exact words were ever spoken, the idea behind them feels true. The California gold rush was never really just about gold. It was about hope. It was about the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. It was about the willingness to leave behind the familiar and travel toward a horizon that promised opportunity, even if no one could say exactly what waited there. The 49ers could not know that their journey would become one of the defining stories of the American West. They could not know that generations later, people would still read their letters, visit the places they built, and wonder what it must have felt like to hear that somewhere beyond the mountains, a river carried the promise of a new life. The camps have long since grown quiet. The abandoned ships have disappeared from San Francisco Bay. The campfires have burned out, and the sound of picks striking stone has faded into history. But the story remains. A story of risk and resilience, of dreams and disappointment, of ordinary people chasing an extraordinary possibility. And perhaps that is why, after all these years, the California Gold Rush is still worth remembering. Because in the end, it was never simply the story of finding gold. It was the story of people searching for a better future, and of the American West itself, forever changed by those who were willing to follow that dream.